They're doing great. We had one mortality in each herd so far, and other than that, they're staying pretty close to their release sites. Of course, we did have 6 sheep that swam the river over to Oregon, but there's not a whole lot of wandering, and there have been a couple of sheep that have wandered away and then come back, so they're really doing well.
Once a week, research biologist Frances Cassier checks on the bighorn sheep of Hell's Canyon.
See, this is where the signal is received, so the antenna is pointing out this way, and it's kind of forming a cone like this.
More than 66 sheep are radio collared in Hell's Canyon.
This is the receiver. We've got 5 different or 6 different herds that we track.
Flip up.
Frances will be searching high above for wild sheep that were brought in from British Columbia in December of 1997. So far, the transplant operation has been a huge success. Through the combined efforts of 3 states, 2 countries, and hundreds of individuals, 39 sheep were brought from Canada and released into Hell's Canyon. It was a venture funded and supported by the Foundation for North American Wild Sheep and part of a long-term plan to manage the bighorns in this area.
I think I see him. Right on that first ridge there. Yeah. Or that first rock outcropping.
Frances calls Hell's Canyon great bighorn habitat that's just crying for wild sheep. Some scientists hope that this new transplant will not only supplement the resident herd, but also provide new genetics that may help fight the battle against the bighorn's deadliest enemy, disease.
4 of us were bedded, 6 feeding, and 1 by itself.
There's down here on the green just below that rock cloud, there's a couple that are right in there.
At one time, thousands of sheep wandered the wilds of Hell's Canyon. But by the 1930s, bighorn sheep were extinct in the area due to a combination of overhunting and disease. Then, in the mid-70s, wild sheep were transplanted here from Canada, and they began to slowly repopulate the area. But the threat of disease never seemed to leave the herd. Outbreaks of pneumonia caused by the bacteria Pasteurella have haunted the Hell's Canyon wild sheep, nearly wiping them out in 1983, 1991, and again in 1995. 3 years of planning went into this latest transplant, and consequently, every time healthy sheep are sighted from the air, it's another small victory.
Is that them right down by the water there in that green spot?
Could be.
What I'm talking about there.
Yeah, I see it. In the trees.
It takes nearly 4 hours to fly the canyon and find each of the radio-collared sheep.
Go to the right. There they are, right on.
It's not a flight for the faint-hearted or the weak-bellied, for that matter. Pilot Doug Gadwa maneuvers the small plane into tight, nauseating turns, circling each herd until Frances has checked every sheep's radio signal and done her best to observe and record their activity.
They crossed the river last week.
Yep, there they are. 2 up there.
Looks like a ewe and a lamb.
After innumerable flights, it's obvious that this biologist and pilot have developed a strong team approach to finding the bighorns.
Definitely. Of course, he knows where the sheep are, and so that helps. And then you kind of know what each other are thinking, even when you don't say anything. After you've worked together a little bit, you kind of have a partnership.
For Doug, it also means an opportunity to combine 2 passions.
Tying together the flying, this kind of flying, with the wildlife adventure, tracking sheep, tracking elk, is just kind of an internal thrill to me to put the 2 together. It really is.
The battery in the radio collars lasts anywhere from 3 to 5 years. As long as they're transmitting a signal, Frances will be flying. But what about the sheep that aren't collared in the canyon, or their offspring? And how will biologists keep count of the sheep once the collars are defunct?
Look on your side.
One of the goals of this project is to increase numbers, and we need to know how many we have to know whether we're doing that. So we know that when we fly, we don't see all the sheep. So what we're trying to do is develop models so we can correct for the sheep that we don't see.
It's called a sightability model. Scientists know that certain factors increase the likelihood of seeing an animal from the air. For example, a sheep on the move is easier to spot than one bedded. An animal in shadow may be harder to see than a bighorn in bright sunlight and so forth. Another factor is terrain. In the early 1990s, the Bureau of Land Management and the Idaho Department of Fish and Game cooperated on a study to develop a sightability model for bighorns in the Owyhee Desert.
We put observers out on these various points out here, and then they have sheep in sight. We come flying through in a helicopter like we were doing a standard census, and we have the observers on the ground tell us whether or not we saw the sheep.
The study revealed that in the Owyhee Canyons, the helicopter crew detects 67% of the moving sheep, but only 33% of those standing still.
The idea is for me to watch the sheep so that when the helicopter comes by, we'll have an idea of how many they see or don't see of the ones that I am watching.
But on the flats above the rim, 91% of the moving sheep are counted from the air.
Once the model is developed, when you fly through country and do a census, you'd write down what kind of terrain the sheep were in when you flew by it. Then you could adjust for the proportion that you typically miss in that kind of terrain to come up with an actual number or an actual number estimate.
But Hell's Canyon is a whole different ballgame. In the Owyhee Desert, biologists are dealing with steep, shadowy canyons carved into immense flats. But here, in Hell's Canyon, it's sloping hillsides and mountain peaks. The vegetation also varies dramatically. Instead of the dense sagebrush cover of the Owyhee Desert, there's more grasses. So a whole new sightability model must be developed for the Hell's Canyon bighorn sheep. Once the sightability model is developed and implemented, biologists will be able to keep even better track of the wild sheep and hopefully record a thriving population in this native species flourishing in the magnificent expanse of Hell's Canyon.